Spirit is saying urgent warnings, urgent warnings. Rebeki robusutunda yanamasata. Reki robusutu. He says the urgent requests are being heard. Rabakorobosutu. He specifically says the urgent requests are being known to me. Rabakorobo senderebeki arabasata. He says I am reaching down from heaven. Rikiti robosutu. He says every individual need reke coming to my ear. Robokorobo senderebeki arabasanda bayarabasata. He says I am proclaiming my angels. Rabakorobosutu robusanda yanamasata. He says, I'm sending forth my warriors. Reki robosutunda yanamasata. He says, I'm sending forth a rescue team. Rubukusutu korobo senderebeki arabakorobo senderebeki arabasata. He says, the camps have been infiltrated. Rubukutusutu korobo sanda yanamasata. In so many regions. Rebeki robosutu korobo sanda yana. Again, he says, urgent requests. Rabakorobo senderebeki arabasanda yanamasata are being made to me in this very hour. Rabakatabayo robo suto korobo sete. He says, insurgents. Rebebeki robo sutu korobo sende rebeki arabasanda bayana masata. Rebebebebendibiki rokutu robo sanda yana masata. Reketiki robo sutu robo rabababanda rokutu sutu korobo sanda yana masata. Reki robo sutunda yanamasat. He says, do not hesitate. Do not hesitate to make your requests known unto him. Reketi robo suto. He says, immediately. Rabako robo suto. He says, the urgent requests Rabako robo suto are being answered in this very moment. Roko to robo sendereki arabasata korobo suto. He says, reach up to the heavens. Reki robo suto. He says, decree and declare Roko robo sunda yanamasata, your wants and your needs. He says they're being heard. Rabakoto robosuto. He says the skies are open. Rebebeki robusutu robusutunda yanamasata. Rebebebendibiki rokoto robusenderebeki arabakata. He says I'm sending down gifts. Rebebebendibiki robusutu korobusuto. War strategies, he says. Immediately. He says it is imperative. He says the needs of my people must be met. He says intrinsically, the needs are being met. He says as catastrophe is trying to strike in their lives, I'm reprimanding them. I'm reprimanding those catastrophes. The catastrophes that are trying to develop in states, in regions. He says he's pulling them down. He says immaculate rewards for my children. He said those who have stood in the fire are being rewarded. He says again, urgent requests. He says, petition them. He says, do not be afraid. He says, I am listening. He says, I am listening to every request. He says, make it known, children. Make it known. He says, I am delivering the answers in this moment. Rebebendiviki robokutu sutunda yanamasata kayarabasata. Reketiki robosutunda basata. He says the prayers of the righteous are being heard. He says they're not faint. He says they're not being drowned out. He says the blood is speaking for many who have gone ahead of you. He says the righteous ones that have fallen Their blood is speaking out. He says he is delivering messengers to advocate on your behalf. He says they will speak for you. He says they will navigate through the processes. He says they are already equipped. They will know exactly what to do. He says, I have taught them. And I have prepared them for such a time as this. He says, speak to the masses clearly. He says, do not be afraid to tell them the truth. He says, my advocates are speaking on their behalf. He says, my spirit of truth goes ahead of them. In the deep valleys, he says, in the trenches, he says, I'm pulling up the gut-wrenching things, the hard things. He says, the turnaround is all for a better outcome. He says, perceive it. He says, fathom it. He says, see it in your mind's eye, the success. He says, do not doubt. He says, don't be afraid. I am with you. He says, I am keeping you. He says, I am holding you dear to my heart. He says, every word that you speak, it touches me. He says, it reaches me. He's reaching down and pulling you up, children. I literally can see him reaching down and pulling his children up, giving them a hand. He says it again, your requests are being known to me. He says, I am delivering immaculate speech for the advocates to terrorize the enemies. He says they won't know what to say. He says they will fumble. He says the enemies won't know how to react. They will be dumbfounded. He says, trust in my spirit, for I know all things. He says, I will turn it all around and bring confusion to their camp. He says, they will not win. He says, not by a long stretch. He says, I am the King of Kings and the Lords of all lords, the Lord of all lords. He says, who can fathom my existence? He says, who can frame the world in its existence? He says, I am He, the omniscient one, the omnipresent one, the one who rules over territories and regions. None like